The late afternoon sun cast golden hues across the sprawling parking lot of the upscale Riverview Plaza, where Naomi Carter hurriedly rifled through the front seat of her sleek silver Lexus. She had been running behind all day, and the last thing she needed was to misplace her purse. Her heart pounded as she sifted through receipts, business cards, and stray papers. Come on, she muttered under her breath, barely noticing the buzz of her phone vibrating insistently in the cup holder. She knew it was her office calling. As the youngest district attorney in the state, her schedule was relentless, and today was no exception. If she didn't leave soon, she would miss her next meeting at City Hall. The low hum of an engine caused her to glance up briefly. A black and white police cruiser rolled slowly into the lot, its tires crunching against the pavement as it came to an almost deliberate stop a few spaces away. Naomi took a deep breath, instinctively straightening her posture. She had spent years in law enforcement, enough to know when an officer was fixated on something, or someone. She kept her focus on her car, hoping the officer would move along. But he didn't. Instead, the door swung open with a creak, and a stocky, middle-aged officer with a ruddy complexion stepped out. His nameplate read, O'Donnell, and his eyes, sharp and cold, sized her up with a scrutiny that sent a familiar chill down her spine. His posture was stiff, a hand resting lightly on his duty belt in a way that wasn't outright aggressive but wasn't exactly casual either. Hey, step away from the vehicle. His gruff voice barked across the parking lot. Naomi exhaled slowly, forcing a calm expression onto her face. Officer, this is my car. I'm just looking for my. I said step away. O'Donnell cut her off, his gaze narrowing. Hands where I can see them. Her pulse quickened, but she complied, stepping back from the open driver's side door, her hands slightly raised. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few onlookers hesitating near their vehicles, their eyes flitting between Naomi and the officer. No one intervened. They never did. What are you doing to that car? He asked, his tone laced with suspicion. As I was saying, Naomi said evenly, this is my vehicle. I misplaced my purse, and I was just looking for it. O'Donnell scoffed, stepping closer. Sure you were. Do you have ID? Naomi bit the inside of her cheek. It's in my purse, which is in the car. That's why I was looking for it. The officer's expression twisted into something almost smug. So, no ID, and you expect me to believe you just happen to own this car? He let out a dry laugh. Come on, lady, don't make this harder on yourself. Who does the car belong to? Naomi clenched her jaw. Me. O'Donnell's hand drifted closer to his holster. Right, turn around, hands behind your back. Excuse me? Naomi blinked. You're arresting me? You're acting suspicious, refusing to provide ID, and loitering around a vehicle that clearly isn't yours. O'Donnell stated matter-of-factly. Now, turn around. Anger flared in Naomi's chest, but she knew better than to resist. She turned slowly, exhaling sharply as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click tightly around her wrists. The world seemed to slow as she was led toward the police cruiser. Bystanders watched with wide eyes, some whispering, but none speaking up. Naomi's breath was steady, but her mind was racing. Her phone, her ID, everything that could prove who she was in that car. And yet, she already knew, O'Donnell wasn't interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind the moment he saw her. As she was placed in the back seat of the cruiser, the reality of the situation settled over her. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had been falsely accused, who had been arrested based on nothing more than assumptions. She sat stiffly in the seat, listening as O'Donnell leaned against the open driver's side door, chatting casually with another officer who had arrived. They spoke as if she weren't even there, as if she were already convicted. Minutes stretched into an hour before the station doors finally swung open. A man in a crisp navy suit strode in with an air of controlled fury. His name was Marcus Reed, Naomi's closest friend and one of the best defense attorneys in the city. His dark eyes swept the room before locking onto her. I need to speak with whoever is in charge. Now, Marcus said, his voice sharp. The younger officer from earlier shifted uncomfortably. But O'Donnell smirked. Relax, counselor. She's just another suspect who couldn't keep her story straight. Marcus stepped closer, his presence dominating the space. That suspect is the district attorney of this city. And you just unlawfully detained her." The room went silent. The sergeant on duty glanced up from his paperwork, his brow furrowing. "Wait, what? You heard me," Marcus continued, his voice cutting like steel. "She told you who she was. You ignored her. You refused to check her credentials, run her plates, or allow her a phone call. You profiled her, Officer O'Donnell, and you will be held accountable for it." O'Donnell's face went pale. I was just following protocol," he stammered. "No, you weren't," Marcus shot back, "because if you had, you would have verified her identity before slapping handcuffs on her." The sergeant's face darkened as he turned to O'Donnell. "Is this true? You didn't confirm her ID before making the arrest?" O'Donnell swallowed, but before he could answer, Marcus pressed further. "Call the mayor, the police commissioner, or the governor. For all I care, you will be releasing her immediately. And you will be explaining exactly why this happened." The next hour unraveled with swift action. Naomi was released, her cuffs removed with muttered apologies that she barely acknowledged. O'Donnell, his arrogance crumbling, was pulled into a separate room for questioning. The weight of the mistake he had made was only beginning to sink in. Naomi rolled her shoulders, massaging the raw skin where the cuffs had dug into her wrists. She turned to Marcus, her voice quiet but steady. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Marcus nodded. "No, it isn't." And with that, Naomi Carter walked out of the station, her chin held high. This wasn't just about her own experience. It was about making sure no one else had to go through it again. And she wasn't about to let it slide. The golden afternoon sun had long begun its descent behind the towering skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the nearly deserted parking lot of Westgate Plaza. Naomi Carter, an accomplished civil rights attorney, had parked her black BMW just minutes before, hurriedly shuffling through the driver's seat in search of her misplaced wallet. Her heart pounded with frustration. She was running late for an important meeting regarding a police misconduct case she was handling. The irony was not lost on her. As she fished through the mess of paperwork and receipts, she barely registered the hum of an approaching vehicle until the flashing blue and red lights illuminated her surroundings. A chill ran down her spine. The sinking feeling in her gut told her exactly what was about to happen before she even turned to face the officer. "Step away from the vehicle," a harsh voice commanded. Naomi sighed, straightening her posture. "Officer, this is my car. I'm just looking for my wallet. Hands where I can see them." The command came sharp and unyielding. Slowly, she complied, stepping away from her vehicle with deliberate, calm movements. The officer, whose nameplate read, Mulligan, stalked closer, his hand resting on his holster as though she posed some imminent threat. "What exactly are you doing here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Naomi exhaled slowly. "I misplaced my wallet in my car. I was looking for it." "So, you're saying this is your car?" Mulligan drawled, his skepticism dripping in every word. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Naomi replied evenly. He folded his arms, looking her up and down as if searching for some indication that she was lying. "You got ID on you?" Naomi resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "Like I just said, it's in my wallet, which is in my car." Mulligan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Convenient. How about you step away from the car while I verify that? You could check the registration," Naomi offered, but Mulligan wasn't listening. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Naomi blinked, her stomach flipping. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "I said turn around," Mulligan repeated, his tone hardening. A distant onlooker gasped audibly as Naomi reluctantly complied. Her wrists snapped into cold steel. The familiar sting of injustice burned inside her. "This is a mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Mulligan let out a mocking laugh. "Yeah, I bet it is. You think I haven't heard every excuse in the book?" Naomi clenched her jaw. "I'm an attorney. I know my rights. You didn't even check the registration." "Oh, you're an attorney now? That's rich," he snorted. "Listen, sweetheart, you can tell your little fairy tale to the judge." A wave of humiliation crashed over Naomi as bystanders watched, some whispering, others recording on their phones. She could only hope one of them had enough courage to step forward, to say something, anything. Minutes dragged into an eternity as she sat in the back of the police car, her hands still bound behind her back, her dignity stripped away. No phone call, no way to prove her identity. Just silence, and the ever-present condescension of Officer Mulligan. When the station doors finally swung open, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. A tall, imposing figure in an impeccable charcoal suit strode in, his expression sharp enough to slice through steel. Marcus Reed, Naomi's best friend and one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country, locked eyes with her and then turned his fury on Mulligan. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge. Now," Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Mulligan smirked. "Relax, hotshot." She was acting suspicious. "She is the civil rights attorney who is currently working on the police misconduct case against this very department." Marcus snapped. "And you just unlawfully arrested her." The room fell into stunned silence. "No," Mulligan stammered, his bravado faltering. She didn't have ID. "Because you never let her retrieve it." Marcus shot back, his tone blistering. "You ignored every chance to verify her identity because you had already made up your mind. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences." It didn't take long for the station commander to get involved. Within the hour, Naomi was released, her cuffs removed with muttered apologies that meant nothing. Mulligan was pulled into an internal investigation, his arrogance replaced with uncertainty. Naomi rolled her wrists, staring down at the red marks left behind by the cuffs. She turned to Marcus, her voice measured but firm. "This isn't over." Marcus nodded. "No, it isn't." Justice wasn't just about individual cases. It was about the entire system that allowed officers like Mulligan to act unchecked. And Naomi Carter wasn't about to let that system continue unchallenged. To stand with Naomi and ensure these stories reach more people, don't forget to press the like button. Awareness is the first step to change, and your support makes all the difference. With her chin held high, Naomi walked out of the station. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, detained, or humiliated because of unchecked power. And she would make sure this moment counted. The days that followed Naomi Carter's wrongful arrest were a blur of rage, exhaustion, and a deep-seated determination that had fueled her entire career. The bruises on her wrists from the too tight handcuffs had faded. But the memory of that night, of Officer Mulligan's sneering face, of the way he had dismissed her, ignored her words, and wielded his authority with unchecked arrogance, remained burned into her mind. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about what had been happening for years, to countless others who had neither the power nor the platform to fight back. Naomi knew she had to do more than just clear her name. She had to ensure that Mulligan and every officer like him faced real consequences. The morning after her release, Naomi strode into her office, her usual confidence carrying an added weight of righteous fury. Her assistant, Layla, looked up from her desk with wide eyes. "Naomi, the phone has been ringing all morning. Reporters, civil rights organizations, even the mayor's office, everyone wants a statement." Naomi took a steadying breath. This was bigger than her. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a systemic failure. "Get Marcus on the line. I want to file formal charges against Officer Mulligan and demand an internal investigation into the department's handling of my case." Within hours, the press conference was arranged. Cameras flashed as Naomi stood behind the podium, her voice steady but edged with emotion. "Yesterday, I was handcuffed, humiliated, and detained for searching my own car. I identified myself as an attorney. I requested that the officer verify my registration. I asked for a phone call. All of those rights were denied. Why? Because Officer Mulligan had already decided who I was before I even opened my mouth. This isn't just about me. This is about every black person who has been falsely accused, dismissed, and silenced." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Naomi lifted her chin. "I am calling for the immediate termination of Officer Mulligan, and a full review of the department's policies regarding racial profiling and officer accountability." The backlash against the department was swift. Social media exploded with outrage. Footage of Naomi's arrest going viral. Protests were organized. Officials scrambled to issue statements. But Naomi wasn't interested in their hollow apologies. She wanted action. Mulligan, of course, remained defiant. "I did my job," he sneered in a televised interview. If she had just complied, none of this would have happened. That single sentence sent a fresh wave of fury through the public. Naomi sat in her office, watching the clip, her fingers tightening around her pen. The words were a familiar refrain, used too often to excuse unjust actions. But this time, it wouldn't be ignored. Her legal team worked tirelessly. They combed through Mulligan's record, unearthing complaints of excessive force and racial discrimination that had been buried under red tape. Naomi's case was no longer just about her. It was about exposing the entire system that allowed officers like Mulligan to operate unchecked. A week later, Naomi found herself standing before the Police Accountability Board, facing the department's top brass. Chief Williams, a man who had spent decades defending his officers, folded his hands on the desk in front of him. "Ms. Carter, we acknowledge that mistakes were made in your case, and we regret any distress you experienced." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Mistakes?" She leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "Your officer violated my civil rights. He refused to check my credentials, denied me a phone call, and then mocked me when I tried to explain who I was. That wasn't a mistake, Chief. That was a choice." Williams shifted uncomfortably. But Naomi wasn't finished. How many other complaints have been buried? How many times has this department protected officers like Mulligan instead of protecting the people they swore to serve? Silence. Then, a reluctant sigh from the chief. "We will be conducting a full review of Officer Mulligan's actions." "That's not enough." Naomi's voice cut through the room. "I want him fired. I want an independent audit of every complaint filed against him. And I want mandatory de-escalation and anti-bias training implemented across the department." The tension in the room was palpable. For years, officers like Mulligan had operated with impunity, shielded by bureaucracy and unspoken loyalty. But now, under the scrutiny of public outrage and undeniable evidence, the department was cornered. 2 days later, the official announcement came. Mulligan was terminated. His history of misconduct exposed for all to see. The department pledged sweeping reforms, promising stricter oversight and increased transparency. It was a victory, but Naomi knew it was only the beginning. That night, she stood on the balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice was within reach. To stand with Naomi and ensure real change continues. Press the like button. Let's make sure this story is heard by as many people as possible. Justice begins with awareness, and together, we can hold those in power accountable. The battle wasn't over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. Naomi Carter knew that her case had made headlines. But she also knew that her experience was far from unique. If anything, it was a single, glaring example of a system that had failed too many people before her, and would continue failing others unless real systemic change was implemented. The night of Officer Mulligan's termination had been a brief moment of triumph. But it wasn't enough. It never was. She had seen it before, police departments making high-profile firings to pacify the public, only to allow the culture of bias and unchecked authority to persist. Naomi refused to let this become another one of those moments. She was determined to ensure that this wasn't just a victory for her but for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or wrongfully accused. Her next step was clear. She had to take the fight beyond the courtroom, beyond press conferences, and into the very heart of the system itself. That was how she found herself sitting in a stark, overly air-conditioned conference room at City Hall, across from a panel of city officials and community leaders. They had called this meeting to discuss reforms, but Naomi could see the tension in their eyes. Some of them viewed her as an outsider stirring up trouble, a disruptor forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths. She didn't care. Change was never comfortable. "The public has lost faith in this department," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "They see officers like Mulligan as the symptom of a disease that runs far deeper. We can't keep acting as if firing one officer will fix the problem." Councilman Everett, a seasoned politician with a reputation for sidestepping controversy, leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, we understand your concerns, but these things take time. We can't overhaul an entire institution overnight." Naomi's lips pressed together. She had heard this argument too many times. Time isn't the issue, Councilman. Accountability is. How many more people need to be profiled, arrested, or worse before we take this seriously? A murmur spread across the room. Some officials shifted uncomfortably, while a few nodded in quiet agreement. Naomi continued, unwavering, "I'm not here asking for empty promises. I'm here because I intend to be involved in the oversight of these reforms. I want a seat on the Police Accountability Committee. And I want the community to have a voice in this process. That was the moment the real battle began. The pushback was immediate. There were hushed conversations, exchanged glances, and then outright resistance. We already have an oversight committee, one official muttered. And yet, it failed to prevent what happened to me. Naomi countered. The current system doesn't work. We need real civilian oversight, not just bureaucratic rubber stamps. It took weeks of meetings, public pressure, and media scrutiny. But eventually, Naomi's persistence paid off. She was granted a position on the committee. But she didn't celebrate. This was just the beginning. If they thought placing her in a committee seat would pacify her, they were mistaken. She had no intention of being a figurehead. She was here to force real change. Her first move was bringing the community into the process. She organized town halls, inviting residents to share their experiences, their fears, and their frustrations. She listened to mothers who had seen their sons stopped by police for no reason, fathers who feared for their children's futures, young men and women who had learned to avoid certain neighborhoods just to stay safe. Their voices weren't just stories, they were evidence of a broken system. At the same time, she dug deeper into the department's internal records. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Patterns of racial profiling, excessive force complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, officers who had been quietly transferred rather than disciplined. She compiled everything, preparing to present her findings at the next oversight meeting. But then, something happened that she hadn't expected. Late one evening, as she locked up her office, her phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "Be careful what you're digging into." Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was this a threat? A warning? Either way, it meant she was hitting a nerve. Instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts. She worked tirelessly, partnering with investigative journalists, whistleblowers, and civil rights organizations. If they wanted to scare her, they had picked the wrong woman. The night of the next committee meeting, she walked into City Hall with a folder thick with evidence and a fire in her eyes. The room was packed, not just with officials but with members of the community who had come to support her. She took her seat, met the gazes of those who doubted her, and began to speak. "The corruption in this department runs deep," she stated. "I have proof of policies that encourage racial profiling, of complaints that were buried, of a system designed to protect bad officers instead of the people they serve." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some officials exchanged panicked glances. Councilman Everett cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, these are serious accusations." "They're not accusations," Naomi said, sliding the files across the table. "They're facts." For the first time, she saw real fear in their eyes. Because they knew, they couldn't ignore this. The community wouldn't let them. This was bigger than her case. Bigger than Mulligan. This was the fight for real systemic change. And Naomi Carter wasn't stopping until justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. If you're as invested in this fight as Naomi is, drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. What do you think will happen next? Stay tuned, because this battle is far from over. Naomi Carter stood at the steps of City Hall, the crisp evening air carrying the murmurs of the gathered crowd. The lights from the surrounding buildings cast a soft glow over the hundreds of faces turned toward her. A mix of hopeful, determined, and weary expressions. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. What had started as a personal fight for justice had become something much bigger, a movement. A call for lasting change that could not and would not be ignored. The past months had tested her in ways she never could have imagined. She had faced resistance at every turn, from reluctant city officials to anonymous threats meant to silence her. But instead of breaking her, it had only hardened her resolve. Naomi had learned that justice wasn't won overnight, nor was it gifted willingly. It had to be fought for, piece by piece, with unwavering persistence, and that fight was far from over. Tonight, however, was a moment of victory. The city council had finally passed the police reform bill she had fought so hard to push through. It wasn't perfect, no law ever was, but it was a start. It established stricter oversight, independent investigations into misconduct cases, and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. It was a step toward accountability, toward a future where people wouldn't have to fear those sworn to protect them. Naomi took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The crowd hushed. "Waiting. We did this," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not just me. Not just the city council. We, the people. This victory belongs to every single person who showed up, who spoke out, who refused to be silenced. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. But Naomi raised a hand, signaling for them to hold on. But this is not the end. She continued. Laws can be passed, but real change happens in how we treat each other, in how we hold those in power accountable, in how we teach the next generation that justice is not a privilege, but a right. She scanned the crowd, seeing the faces of the young activists who had marched beside her, the elders who had shared their stories of past struggles, the families who had lost loved ones to unjust systems but still stood here, hopeful. My fight started with a single wrongful arrest, she said, but that was just one battle in a much larger war. The truth is, this fight has existed long before me, and it will continue long after. But as long as I have breath, as long as there is injustice, I will not stop. The roar of the crowd was deafening now. A wave of voices united in purpose. Naomi smiled, but there was no sense of triumph in her eyes, only determination. This wasn't about personal gain. It was about ensuring that no one else had to go through what she did. It was about building a future where fairness and justice weren't abstract ideals but everyday realities. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached her, some shaking her hand, others sharing their own experiences. A young woman, barely in her 20s, hesitated before stepping forward. You inspired me, she said softly. I want to go to law school now. I want to fight, like you do. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. This was why she fought. Not just for herself, not just for policy changes, but for the generations that would come after. For the ones who would pick up the torch and carry it forward. She reached for the young woman's hand and squeezed it. Then promise me something, she said. Promise me you won't let the setback stop you. Promise me that no matter how hard it gets, you'll keep going, because the world needs more fighters. The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I promise. Naomi stepped back, looking out over the city that had once felt so suffocating but now seemed filled with endless possibilities. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more obstacles, more battles, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for the future, and for those watching, for those who had followed her journey. This was your moment too. Change isn't something that happens because one person demands it. It happens when we all stand together, when we refuse to back down, when we commit ourselves to doing what's right even when it's hard. If Naomi's story has moved you, if you believe in the fight for justice, then show your support. Like this video, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and follow this channel for updates. Because this isn't just her story, it's all of ours. And together, we will continue to push forward. This is just the beginning. Stay with us for the next chapter.